Combat activity across Ukraine continues every day, and all signs point to a second mobilization in Russia after the new year. Even after Putin declared the first mobilization over and done, many more soldiers were still being called up for duty. But now, at the end of November, Ukraine is wet and muddy, and both sides of the conflict line are waiting for a deep winter freeze to harden the ground and give heavy machinery a chance to move into position. There are still battles every day around Bakhmut in the Luhansk region, and some experts say the Russian military is slowly encircling the city, while Ukrainian forces are showing signs of increased activity in the south and east. What this all means in the face of a coming winter freeze is the subject of a new Moscow Times article from correspondent James Beardsworth. James joins us now with an update from the many fronts of the war. Hi, James. Thank you so much for being with us. So many questions about the war. And you have talked to the experts and published this piece. Very interesting. So first thing that I was wondering about is what to expect, actually, on the ground in Ukraine. We understand that winter is coming, but it's not freezing so far. What does this change, actually?
Yeah, well, I think actually right now we find ourselves at an interesting point in the war. We obviously have Russia that looks to be digging in right the way across this long line in the east of Ukraine, as well as in the south. We've seen fortifications being put up around Zaporizhia, as well as also fortifications in mainland Russia in cities like Belgorod. On top of that, Ukraine finds itself in an interesting position where, of course, it's just retaken the city of Kherson, and it finds itself with quite high morale. Russia, on the other hand, kind of wants to see the next few months out. Of course, Russia is still within the throes of its first mobilization wave, which means that it's just starting to send hundreds of thousands of more men to Ukraine, which, of course, Russia is hoping is it's going to be able to sort of dig in and muddle through the winter. I propose that sort of for Ukraine, actually, what they might want to do in the next few months is try to push, whilst the morale is high, as you mentioned, while it's not completely freezing and the weather isn't becoming too much of a problem, to try to fight for positions, which when the spring comes next year, they'll be in a more sort of advantageous position to then launch a wider offensive and look to capture more parts of eastern and southern Ukraine.
So do you understand correctly that Russia's main force is the quantity of people on the ground, and this mobilization has shown that it really means something, right? That Ukraine has morale, Russia has quantity of men. Do you expect, and do the experts who you are talking with about this war expect the next wave of mobilization in Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting question. Obviously, you mentioned there the pure mass of men. I think right now Russia has about 150,000 men training in Belarus. And whilst, of course, we know that many of these men are going to be poorly trained, poorly equipped, of course, their mass counts for something. We're talking about a huge amount of personnel here. I think what Russia is essentially hoping is once it fully sends all of these men to the battlefield, then just by the sheer mass, they will be able to make a difference. Now, you also touch upon there the idea of a second wave of mobilization. I think we're a little bit early to talk about that, and here's why. The first of that is, of course, it were only just months into the first wave of mobilization. Russia is still in the process of training men, and we already know that it's got limited resources in terms of officers and equipment. The second of those is also, I think, due to the fact of what Russia wants to achieve in the next few months. We know that Russia wants to dig in. It wants to use this glut of men to be able to hold its positions. And I think only when the spring comes, the weather turns and Russia finds itself in a position where these men are fully ingested into the armed forces, will it actually then want to go back onto the offensive.
Oh, that's really interesting, because there are Russian experts that we talk with, of course, who insist that the next wave of mobilization will start after January, in the beginning of next year. But my last question is actually about Crimea, the main part of Ukraine, which is, I would say, the most sacral, the most important for Vladimir Putin and his government, and for Russians who believe in this war. So what does Russian government and what do Russian, commanders do to fortify its positions around Crimea?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think you may have come across in the last week, we've seen satellite imagery of these small concrete pyramids that have been placed right the way across the sort of entrance to Crimea from the north. Of course, it would be a huge symbolic victory for Ukraine to take back Crimea. I would propose that right now, both Russian commanders as well as Ukrainian commanders aren't thinking about this. We, of course, have huge swathes of Kherson on the east bank of the river, as well as almost, I think, 60% of the southern part, the Zaporizhia region, that's still within Russian hands. I think the Ukrainian commanders will be sort of focusing on that. And only once those areas have returned back into the hands of Kiev will Crimea really be on the table.
And you're saying that Russian government does not expect anything serious around Crimea, right?
I would propose that right now, in the short term, absolutely not. Obviously, as we enter in the spring and we see more movement on the battlefield, and whether Russia can actually deploy these mobilized men in an effective way, only then will the Crimea question actually be on the table. Right now, I propose it's not.
All right. Thank you very much for your input.